Astonishing Legends Network.
Merry Christmas in July, everyone. Aren't y'all just about ready for some Christmas right about now? Cloudy, cold, rainy, maybe some snow. I don't know. I've always had a weird clock. In July, I start thinking about Christmas. It's gone that way my whole life. I'm always like 3 or 4 months ahead of schedule. But I figured, you know what? Today is July 25th. We're exactly 5 months away from Christmas Day. But why not do a little celebrating now? So today we're going to talk about our very first nonfiction book that we've ever covered on Richard Hatem's Paranormal bookshelf. We're talking about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And you're going to hear it in a minute, but I want to say it out loud right now, right up front, because a lot of us are feeling a little stuck in our lives right now. We're all feeling a little overcome by events, maybe a little powerless in our own lives to make things better. And I think that's the key to A Christmas Carol. I think it reminds us that the greatest change we can make in the world is what I like to call ground level and arm's distance. You can make powerful changes in this world, just in your own small circle. You don't have to travel. You don't have to change the world. Just look at just how you treat the people in your family, your friends, the people you see on a daily basis in your neighborhood, maybe at work. These are the people in your lives. These are the people that you have an effect on. So reach out to them, check in on them, see how they're doing. It's scary sometimes, I know, especially now, we all kind of want to crawl into a hole, but you know what? Reach out to someone. Arm's distance from you in your life, do it today. I think you'll be really glad you did. Okay, real quick, some housekeeping. This is Dallas News, the Dallas live show. We now finally have a location and we have a new date, okay? The show is going to be on Monday, August 18th at 7 o'clock, and it's going to be at the On Rotation Brewery and Kitchen, okay? A fan of the show manages this place, and he reached out and he offered it to us, and I just could not have been happier to accept. Tickets are available right now at Eventbrite. So go to Eventbrite, look up Richard Hatem's Paranormal bookshelf. It'll take you right to the page. Tickets are on sale now. All right, now light some candles, pour yourself a glass of mulled wine or hot apple cider or cold apple cider. Find something in your house that smells like pine or berries, or just go to the spice rack, grab down some cinnamon, sniff on that. Do whatever you got to do to get into your Christmas mood, because that's where we're headed, folks. Here we go. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It's weird to think about, but it totally follows. Your favorite author has a favorite author. One of my favorite authors is Charles Dickens, and his favorite author was Washington Irving. My favorite Charles Dickens book is A Christmas Carol, Chapman and Hall, London, 1843. And as it turns out, much of its structure and themes were inspired by Washington Irving. Dickens' lush descriptions of Christmas celebrations are deeply indebted to those Irving evokes in his Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. In the mid-19th century, Christmas celebrations were on the decline both in America and in England. But it was the writings of these two men that seemed to ignite a revival of interest in this most noble holiday. They reminded people of the pure sensual pleasure of the season, the cooked goose, the mulled wine, the peppermint candy and gingerbread cookies and spiced cakes, joyful dancing and game playing inside warm houses beside roaring fires, and stolen kisses in the shadows beneath trimmed twigs of mistletoe. But it was the notion of spiritual transformation, delivered by colorful and enchanting spirits, that Dickens most notably borrowed from Irving's Rip Van Winkle when he created a story called The Goblin and the Sexton, which appears in his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. It's all about a surly man named Gabriel Grubb who undergoes a complete emotional metamorphosis after being kidnapped by goblins on Christmas Eve. Sound familiar? This was an early try, a first draft, you might say, of the story that eventually became the immortal novel A Christmas Carol. Now let's be clear. I'm not suggesting a case of artistic theft or even self-theft, because outside of outright plagiarism, I don't believe those things truly exist. I believe that creativity is an ever-flowing act from person to person, consuming and then producing and then consuming some more, borrowing and then refining and recreating, reading and then writing about the themes and emotions that matter to us the most over and over again, and trying just one more time to get it right. I was kidnapped by the ghosts of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol as a child, when my family brought me to see Scrooge, the movie starring Albert Finney, with screenplay and music by Leslie Bricusse. That movie fucked me up. I have no clear memory of who I was when I walked into that theater, but I've never been the same since. I had never even seen a movie before, never been in a theater. The experience was overwhelming, obliterating. Between the music and the dancing, and Alec Guinness showing up as an eerie but kind of funny Jacob Marley, and the raucous Cockney street kids harassing an impossibly cruel and hateful Ebenezer Scrooge, and the jolly giant ghost of Christmas Present played by Kenneth Moore, who sings I Like Life, which could easily be my personal theme song, and the brilliant and instantly lovable Tom Jenkins, who sings the Oscar-nominated Thank You Very Much, a song which was my very first introduction to the notion of irony, all the way up to the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, turning into a skeleton and pushing Scrooge into an open grave, where he falls all the way down to hell and ends up being wrapped in chains while Marley laughs at him. This, as it turns out, is not in the original book. Anyway, it was all too much for me. My older cousins Gail and Lindy still tease me for screaming at the scary parts. But I also cried for reasons I couldn't understand when Scrooge changes and becomes so grateful that he's been given a chance to begin again. In my defense, I was 4 years old. 4! What were my parents thinking? I blame them, but I don't fault them. I'm glad they did it, because that movie, that story, hit me like a million-pound shithammer at such a young age, and it's had a greater impact on me than any other work of art I've ever had rammed down my throat since. But I realize now it's more than that. A Christmas Carol isn't just one of the greatest novels ever written. One of the reasons it's so important to me is because I have come to realize that A Christmas Carol is also one of the most vivid near-death experiences ever described in fiction. It was Friday, December 21st, 2001, and I had not yet watched my VHS copy of Scrooge that year, and wasn't even sure I would. Christmas that year just didn't feel like Christmas. But then, neither had Christmas of 1999 or 2000. When you're in a marriage that is in decline, the holidays become a surreal backdrop against which you act out your role as part of a normal, happy family, even when you know you're not. At all the Christmas gatherings I went to, I felt like I was wearing my sadness and failure and fear like a sunburn. I'm sure I behaved in a way designed to overcorrect for what felt like the glaring defects in my life. In private moments, I would think, maybe we can get through Christmas with things being okay. Maybe Christmas will make things okay. A childlike part of my heart hoped that Christmas would magically transform things, transform me, and my marriage would be saved. After all, isn't that what Christmas is for? But it was now December 2001, and the magic hadn't come through. I was separated from my wife, Michelle, and we were into an alternating weekly custody schedule with our sons, Owen and Spencer, then 5 and 3. That Friday was the beginning of my week with them, and we slipped into our normal routine. I picked them up from daycare at 6 p.m. They were always the last kids to go home, and it was already full dark. We hit Blockbuster and rented a weekend's worth of videos, then got pizza from Round Table, and then drove home to the house I was renting on Queensberry Road in Pasadena. I had gone out that day and spent $300 on Christmas decorations from Walmart. Outdoor lights, indoor lights, a fresh-cut tree, and some odd cone-shaped snowman decorations that stood on the front lawn and lit up and from a distance looked like a jolly Christmas Klan rally. But it was Christmas, or the best I could do at the moment. I wanted the place to look fun and cozy and Christmassy for them. I was worried that they would notice how sparse things looked and be disappointed. But as it turned out, I was disappointed when they didn't seem to notice the decorations at all. I wanted their first Christmas since the separation to be warm and special and magical. But really, what I wanted was for them to reassure me that I was pulling it off. Because we almost never ate dinner together as a family when Michelle and I were together, I immediately decided when I first moved out that we would. I bought a beautiful handmade table in Portland, Oregon, which would be our family dinner table, where we'd eat every night and talk about our days. I began enforcing this new rule immediately, and Owen and Spencer were, of course, confused and annoyed. Why weren't we watching television during dinner like a normal family? But after a while, we got into a routine. I'd start out by asking them what the worst part of their day was, and then if there was any time left over, we'd moved on to what was best. I'm pleased to tell you that even at that age, they were able to see the comic possibilities in the question. And they made up stories about all the terrible things that had happened in daycare, mostly involving poopy diapers, and exactly how poopy they were and what the poop looked like and smelled like, and where those poopy diapers got thrown and on whose head they landed. On that particular night, Owen turned to me after he'd finished his pizza and said, Dad, do you know what I really want for Christmas? No, I did not, and I didn't want to. All I could think was that he was going to say something like, I want you and Mom to get back together. But that isn't what he said. What he said was 1,000,000 times worse. I want a Game Boy Advance. Now, like any good parent, I had spent the past month relentlessly grilling my children about what they wanted for Christmas. And as I said, the stakes this Christmas were extremely high. I had to pull Christmas off in a big way. I didn't want to overwhelm them, but at the same time, I couldn't afford to disappoint them. Now, it was 2001, and I knew that the Game Boy was a popular toy among kids, but most of those kids were a little older than mine, and besides, my kids just weren't interested in video games yet. Or so I thought. But somehow, Owen had gotten a whiff of what the older kids were into and decided it was time to partake. Great. We finished dinner, and then Owen and Spencer ran into the living room to watch their Powerpuff Girls and Dexter's Laboratory videos. While they were occupied, I got on the phone. I called every GameStop within a 25-mile radius and was informed by every single one of them that they had absolutely no Game Boy Advances left and would not have any more until sometime in January. This was very bad news indeed. But I still had one thin sliver of hope. I knew a guy with connections, a guy who might be able to help. A guy named Hugh Sterbakov. A lot of my free nights over the past few years were spent hanging out with Hugh Sterbakov, a friend of mine from my writers group, and he was unlike any friend I'd ever had before. He was 27, 8 years younger than me. No wife, no kids. As far as I could tell, all he did all day was play video games, eat something called boule sauce, and get high. Two of those things made me physically ill, so when we hung out, I just ate the boule sauce. Hugh was from Philadelphia, and I think that was connected with this boule sauce, which was basically tomato sauce with ground beef and giant hunks of pepperoni, seasoned with red chili flakes, cayenne pepper, ground mustard, and an entire bottle of wine. Any color, any kind, didn't matter. We'd eat it on pasta, rice, bread. More than once, in a nod toward health, we ladled it over giant bowls of torn lettuce and topped it with croutons and grated cheese. Once, with no other options available, I saw Hugh dump some into a bowl of Captain Crunch. Boule sauce tasted great, and it was the food equivalent of Hugh himself. Familiar but strange, comforting but dangerous, and always, always there. There really wasn't anything truly dangerous about Hugh, except for the fact that he knew me really well and didn't know Michelle at all. So, he was the person I ended up talking to more than anyone else about my accumulating fear that my marriage was dying. Hugh would listen to me like a man hearing about the strange customs of a foreign country. But his opinion always boiled down to, one way or another, you deserve not to be miserable. And whatever you decide to do, I'm there to do it with you. The more I talked, the more real the possibility of getting divorced felt. And the more real it felt, the less scary it felt. At least while I was hanging out with Hugh, eating boule sauce and watching Jaws for the 50th time. Hugh made whatever money he needed writing reviews for a video game magazine. He didn't need much money because his main expense was video games, and he got most of those for free. Since October, he'd been telling me to buy Game Boys for Owen and Spencer. So, I was expecting to get a lot of shit when I told him what I needed, but instead, he seemed even more upset than I was. 6 hours ago, I could have gotten you 10 of them. A friend of his had a promotional box load and was literally giving them away to his friends, specifically friends with kids. It even occurred to Hugh to grab a couple for Owen and Spencer just in case, but he knew I wouldn't allow it, and he didn't want to deprive some other kid of having the best Christmas of their life, so he passed. Hugh hung up and called his friend and then called me back. No luck, the free ones were gone. I told him about all my fruitless calls to GameStop, and then Hugh said, "All right, fat ass, let me see what I can do," and he hung up. Hugh liked to call me fat ass for reasons that were never clear, aside from the hilarious fact that I wasn't fat and barely had an ass. Hugh actually was kind of fat, and he had a habit of finishing a giant meal of boule sauce by rubbing his stomach and murmuring, "Girthy." After a while, Girth became his nickname, and it's how he's been listed in my phone contacts since 1999. Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843, exactly 132 years before a man named Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life, the book that defines the near-death experience. But as we know, near-death experiences have been going on as long as there have been people to have them. The elements of a near-death experience are not carved in stone, but they have over the years boiled down to essentially these 7 stages. 1. A feeling of peace and well-being. 2. A separation from the physical body. 3. Veridical experiences, including accurate awareness of distant events. 4. Encountering a brilliant light. 5. Meeting dead loved ones and, quote, beings of light. 6. A life review and possible visions of future events. And 7. A choice to return to the physical body. Every single one of these stages is described in A Christmas Carol, but intriguingly, they play out in almost the exact opposite order. But hey, I'm not an AP English, and neither are you, I hope. The important thing is that both A Christmas Carol and near-death experiences are miraculous things that I can barely believe we're lucky enough to have in our lives. And they both end by giving us a greater love for life and our fellow man than we had when we started. Is there any greater gift? Now, I'm certain Dickens wasn't consciously writing about NDEs when he wrote A Christmas Carol. In fact, when he wrote it, he had other real-life issues on his mind, most prominently, the lack of education available to England's poverty-stricken children. On Thursday, October 5th, 1843, Dickens was in Manchester to deliver an address on this very topic at the Athenaeum, a charitable institution that served the city's poor. And it was while he was speaking on these problems, and at the same time struggling with how to address his concerns head-on in his fiction, that the idea for A Christmas Carol began to take form in his mind. Rather than write an overtly political story, he conjured instead a fable filled with ghosts that played out like a dream or a poem, or most accurately, like a song, A Christmas Carol. And instead of chapters, it would be divided into musical staves. He wanted it to appeal to the soul, not the intellect. He wasn't out to change laws or even minds. He was out to change people's hearts by breaking them and then rebuilding them anew. So yes, ghosts were important, but just as important was Christmas. Because as Dickens states in Stave 1, Christmas is, quote, a time when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. And it was, as Scrooge's nephew Fred observes, quote, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. This is my favorite quote from the book because it cuts so quickly and so poignantly to the heart of our human situation. The people we love, the people we hate, the people we fear or admire or envy or pity or hold in contempt, every last one of them will end as we will, in death, the great leveler. Dickens knew that by setting the story during Christmas, much of his work would be done for him because his readership would already be halfway his when the story begins. The themes that Christmas brings would be ever present in their minds. All he had to do was drive them home. And anyway, it was getting on to mid-October. Christmas was coming. Dickens ruminated on his story during long midnight walks through the streets of London, 15 or 20 miles a night, as the weather grew colder and colder by the day. If he wanted to publish his book by Christmas, he knew he would only have 6 weeks to write it. One last thing. Dickens needed a hit. His last novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, had been a flop. It too explored the themes of selfishness and greed, but it did so with the cold knife of satire. Dickens now knew better. He would approach this book with a warm and open heart, and the humor he would employ would be that of a knowing narrator sharing a nudge with a knowing reader, putting us all on one side of Ebenezer Scrooge, allowing us to see his flaws clearly, and also see the exact ways in which we share them. Dickens bet everything on A Christmas Carol. According to Michael Patrick Hearns's Introduction to the Annotated Christmas Carol, W. W. Norton and Company, 1976, quote, Chapman and Hall agreed to bring out A Christmas Carol on commission terms. Under this proposal, which Dickens himself made, the author was charged the full cost of production, and thus was entitled to the entire profits from the sales. As he was paying all costs, Dickens could do whatever he wanted. But he also insisted that the price of the book be low, only 5 shillings, to encourage as many buyers as possible. Dickens personally oversaw every aspect of the volume's manufacture. He approved the russet cloth binding, stamped with the title in gold on the front and on the spine, the color end papers, the gilt edges, and the title page printed in green and red. The result was a beautifully designed volume that far exceeded anything else then being sold for a mere 5 shillings. In other words, Dickens' margins were tight. The book would have to be an overwhelming success for him to clear his current debts and see any sort of a profit. Now, it may seem strange to you, even contradictory, to discuss commercial success as a motive in the writing of A Christmas Carol. But let's not forget, dude was a dude, and dude was a writer. And after getting his ass dragged for Martin Chuzzlewit, dude wanted to prove he still had the mojo. Copyright laws existed on paper in both England and America in 1843, but they were rarely enforced. The pirating of books on both sides of the Atlantic was a common and very profitable practice. Dickens, a vocal advocate of author copyright protections, knew this would happen with A Christmas Carol. He knew he would only have the Christmas season itself in which to sell copies of his book in which he could expect to participate in a lion's share of the profits. And he was correct. Published on December 19th, 1843, the book was an instant success, both critically and commercially. But by the first week of the new year, cheap pirated editions were flooding the bookstalls of London. And by February, unlicensed stage productions were being mounted all over England, the profits from which Dickens never saw a dime. Now, Dickens, as well as being a writer, was also an actor. And it was only through decades of live readings all throughout Europe and America that he eventually received true credit and profit from his own work. When he died in 1870, he knew that of all the many thousands of pages of fiction he had produced, it was this one slim volume of just 166 pages that would ensure his literary immortality. Not a single Christmas Eve since 1843 has passed without someone reflecting on the strange tale of Ebenezer Scrooge and how his whole life changed in the course of a single night. On Christmas Eve 2001, I was in the McDonald's drive-thru line, and I was depressed. But I was even more depressed for the people working there. Owen and Spencer were strapped into their car seats. Bing Crosby and David Bowie sang The Little Drummer Boy, one of the most depressing versions of one of the most depressing Christmas songs of all time. We got our food and I drove up to Hastings Ranch, a neighborhood above Pasadena, where just about every house for miles in all directions puts up lights and decorations, each one trying to outdo the other. But all I could focus on were the houses with no lights or decorations at all, each one looking like a missing tooth in an eager grin. What was their story? Were they out of town? Or were there people inside those dark houses, staring quietly out at the slow-moving line of cars that clogged their streets every Christmas Eve? At least my house on Queensberry had lights. From the outside, it looked happy. By 9 o'clock, both kids were fast asleep. So I drove away from Hastings Ranch and headed south to the Pasadena Freeway. There was almost no traffic. Everyone who had somewhere to be that night was already there. I looped from the 110 onto the 5 South and then onto the 10 East. Now I was basically driving toward my parents' house, although that wasn't my destination that night. Up until 5 years ago, it would have been. My mom hosted Christmas Eve for her side of the family at our house in Monterey Park, where I grew up, every year since I was a child. My job from the time I was about 10 was to make the punch. The recipe is simple: a liter of 7-Up and a liter of Hawaiian Punch poured over a half-gallon of raspberry sherbet in a big glass bowl. It is friggin' delicious, even without booze. But don't worry. Booze was in no short supply around my house in those days. There was a bourbon called 10 High that my dad would buy on discount by the caseload, and it was the drink of choice in my family. When I was finally old enough to drink on Christmas Eve, around 15, that's what I had, mixed with 7-Up. One was plenty to make my ankles weak. I was afraid to go any further. I left that to the real grown-ups. Before dinner, we did presents, which meant we all gathered in the living room and went around in a big circle one by one until every gift had been opened. Grammy and Grampy always batted cleanup because Aunt Carol, Aunt Sally, and my mom always went overboard buying them gifts. Us kids would get bored, so at a certain point, Grampy would start wadding up the used wrapping paper into tight balls and pitching them at our heads. And that got us back into the game, throwing them back at him until our moms told us to knock it off. This sort of behavior went on until we were deep into our 20s, even 30s. On Christmas Eve, we all became kids again, at least for one night. And it was my favorite night of the year, the one constant, the one thing that never changed. As the years went by, we lost Grampy, and then my Aunt Carol. But the annual gathering kept on. But when my grandmother finally died, so did Christmas Eve. To be fair, it was my mom's fault. When my grandmother finally couldn't live alone anymore, my mom moved her into our house so she could be in charge of every minute of whatever remained of her life. But at the same time, she blamed my Aunt Sally for not helping enough. Over time, resentments grew. My grandmother managed to live just long enough for my mom and Aunt Sally to stop speaking to each other. And for the next 12 years, until the day my mother died, they never did. No death marks the beginning of A Christmas Carol. The one important death, that of Jacob Marley, occurs 7 years before the beginning of the novel. As our friendly narrator explains, quote, "Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. This must be distinctly understood or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate." The same can be said of any near-death experience. In almost every case, the assurance of death is foremost. You know, he was pronounced clinically dead for over 18 minutes, that sort of thing. So that we understand that what happened was no mere hallucination. It was the result of a soul's journey into a new reality. Now, I am suggesting that A Christmas Carol is Scrooge's near-death experience, and there's only one problem with this theory. Scrooge doesn't die at the beginning of the book. I know. I've searched the text for even a metaphorical death, and I can't really find anything. Instead, what I find is Christmas Eve, which, kind of like Halloween, stands in for a date on the calendar during which the living and the dead are most likely to intermingle. Christian or pagan, our foundational stories of the season depend upon our shared agreement that on Christmas Eve, all bets are off. Anything can happen. And it is with this understanding that we enter into Scrooge's Long Night of the Soul. Look, even some of our most modern stories of the paranormal occur eerily close to Christmas Eve. The Lutz family moved into their house in Amityville on December 23rd. And Whitley Strieber was abducted by aliens on December 26th. We get it. Christmas is haunted. And to be honest, I wouldn't have it any other way. The first thing that happens to Scrooge, once he's properly alone in that awful, cold, empty house of his, is what in NDE lore would be called an encounter with a dead loved one. Okay, so maybe Jacob Marley isn't exactly a loved one, but who else does Scrooge have? Marley was the only guy who understood him and tolerated him because, as we come to find out, they were very much alike. Which makes all of his warnings to Scrooge so frightening. He knows whereof he speaks. Marley then introduces Scrooge to other phantoms of the dead that are ever present but invisible to Scrooge and us until this moment. From the book, Scrooge followed Marley to the window and looked out. The air was filled with phantoms wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant who had saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. What an absolutely beautiful and horrifying thought, that when you die, pain is distributed to you in accordance with the number of kind acts you could have performed while alive, but did not. Marley informs Scrooge that he will be visited by 3 ghosts, and all 3 of those fit into the description of the stage of the near-death experience called Encounters with Beings of Light. The first one is the Ghost of Christmas Past, and if you've never read the book, you're missing out because this is such a weird-looking ghost. It constantly morphs from looking like an old man to looking like a child, and every age in between. And a beam of light shines out of its head, and the hat it's holding looks like a candle damper. Okay, in other words, this ghost is the personification of memory. It's a combination of every age and experience Scrooge has ever had. The cap, of course, is what dims memory. And when Scrooge tries to make him put it on, the ghost gets pissed and basically says, "You've been tamping out the light of memory your whole life, and now you're asking me to do it again? No way, Jose. Tonight it's all coming back to you. Everything you've blocked out, you're going to see it all." In other words, in the jargon of the near-death experience, Scrooge is about to have a life review. In the typical life review, a person will experience every single moment of their life, usually in one all-encompassing and profoundly moving download. It happens in a flash. And you not only relive all the emotions of every event, but you also experience the emotions of every single other person involved in those events. And this is exactly what happens to Ebenezer Scrooge. He relives his days as a schoolchild, being left behind in the schoolhouse over the holidays. And this I could never understand. Was he completely alone? Did he have food? Was there like a teacher or a janitor or any adult supervision of any kind? Now, I'm sure to some of you, this is paradise. You get to skip all the holiday gatherings and spend Christmas alone, with nothing but a fireplace and a stack of books. And to this I say, I get it, and God bless you. Now we move forward in time and see Scrooge working in a warehouse. His boss is a guy called Fezziwig, a jovial sort of cross between Mickey Rooney and SpongeBob SquarePants. And he's a much nicer boss than Scrooge, that's for sure. And here's where Scrooge has a classic life review insight. My boss Fezziwig made my working life a pleasure, but I'm making Bob Cratchit's working life a living hell. The fuck is wrong with me? And from here, we are whisked to an absolutely heartbreaking scene where a slightly older Scrooge is unceremoniously dumped by his fiancée Belle. It's really one of the great breakup scenes in all of literature. Belle is totally composed, incredibly eloquent, states all of her reasons, makes it clear that it's you, not me, returns the ring, and walks out. And the whole time Scrooge just kind of sits there, annoyed to be interrupted from making money, and squinting at her thinking the Old English equivalent of, bitches be crazy. But make no mistake, Scrooge is devastated by this. And the way I see it, he's already half transformed after this scene. We all live our lives in the context of our memories and the emotions they carry with them. Maybe the memories are painful, as they are for Scrooge, but to intentionally block them out is like performing a do-it-yourself lobotomy. It's the beginning of dehumanization. It's the beginning of the end. I got off the freeway that night at City Terrace Drive and headed up into the hills. Girth had called earlier that day and announced, "I just saved your Christmas, fat ass." He had tracked down a GameStop employee named Armando who had been stockpiling Game Boys since last summer, buying them up with his employee discount and then holding them until December when he began selling them at an outrageous markup. Girth had given me the address, and as I searched for it, the streets grew narrow and twisty with impossible hairpin turns. Finally, I found the house. The street was packed with cars, so I had to pull into the driveway. I figured it would be okay. I wasn't going to be there long. I got out of the car and walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. Hundreds of Christmas lights were hung everywhere, and they all blinked on and off at the exact same time. I could hear loud voices inside and ranchero music, and I could smell the absolutely delicious but out-of-place summer aroma of wood smoke and barbecued meat. The door opened, and I looked down at a little kid with hair so dark brown it looked black. He was grinning up at me like he was expecting Santa and thought somehow I might be him. "Hi," I said. I'm looking for Armando?" The kid just kept grinning at me. Then he suddenly ran away back into the house. Then a skinny guy, easily a foot taller than me, with a mustache and a soul patch, appeared in his place. "Richard?" "Yeah," I said. "Hang on," he said, and closed the door, leaving me standing on the small cement porch. I was obviously crashing his family's Christmas Eve party. I felt out of place and slightly suspect. The door swung open again, and Armando came out, now wearing a dark olive-colored jacket. He walked me around to what seemed to be the house next door, and we headed up a long driveway into murky darkness. I wondered how long this was going to take. Owen and Spencer were still asleep back in the car. At least I hoped they were. Armando took a set of keys from the pocket of his jacket and unlocked the trunk of a black Dodge Diplomat. The little yellow trunk light illuminated a Budweiser beach towel. He reached down and pulled the towel back, revealing a cardboard box with maybe 8 Game Boys lying loose at the bottom, outside of their packaging. "How many do you want?" he asked. "Just one," I said. He shrugged and nodded toward the box. I looked inside. 6 of them were a translucent pink. 1 was dark blue, and 1 was white. The final dregs. I took the blue one. Then, in the dim yellow light, I reached into my pocket and pulled out 5 $100 bills. Armando took the money from me and jammed it into the pocket of his olive-colored jacket. He closed the trunk and started walking quickly back down the driveway. The deed was done. The whole transaction had felt tawdry and joyless. But what had I expected? Some jolly, wisecracking character? A heartfelt last-minute invitation to join his warm family gathering? I hurried back down the driveway behind him. Once we were back in the light, he bounded up onto his porch, muttered, "Thanks, man," and headed back into his party. From the driveway, I heard a burst of laughter from inside the house. It probably had nothing to do with me. I climbed back into my car. Owen and Spencer were still asleep in their car seats. I backed carefully out of the driveway, then headed down the narrow streets toward the freeway and home. The second of the 3 ghosts, the ghost of Christmas Present, is another being of light. In the movie Scrooge, he is in fact so bright that at first Scrooge can barely see him. And look, as we've talked about on this podcast before, almost every paranormal experience has a light aspect associated with it. Ghosts glow in the dark, UFOs shine in the sky, sometimes so brightly that witnesses suffer from something called Klieg conjunctivitis, in which their eyes become red and swollen for days, sometimes weeks. Luckily, that doesn't happen to Scrooge. Instead, this ghost provides a stage of the near-death experience known as veridical perception. For a near-death experiencer, it usually happens early on. While dead and out of their bodies, experiencers have, in many cases, been able to describe with uncanny accuracy What was happening, for instance, in their own operating room, when according to all logic, they should not be aware of anything at all? In one famous case, a woman who had suffered cardiac arrest found herself floating outside the hospital where she was being treated and saw a single tennis shoe sitting on the ledge of the north side of the third floor of the building. Now, she was able to provide precise details concerning its appearance. The little toe was worn, and one of the shoelaces was stuck underneath the heel. Later, a skeptical social worker who had heard the story decided to check it out for herself. She found the shoe on the ledge exactly as described, though she noted that from her angle, she couldn't confirm the details of the shoe's condition. To do that, she speculated, someone would have to be outside the hospital and hovering just over the ledge. Scrooge floats all over London and gets to peek in on the Cratchit family and see how they're celebrating their Christmas Eve. Then, after making sure they're miserable, he moves on to his nephew's house where a huge party is taking place, and the main activity seems to be everyone sharing the various ways and degrees to which they hate Ebenezer Scrooge. It's pretty brutal. The ghost then transports Scrooge far and wide, to a barren miner's shack, to a lonely lighthouse, to a ship many miles out to sea. And in each of these places, he shows Scrooge how people with far less than he celebrate the holiday with grateful hearts. And being the literal spirit of Christmas, he shakes magical ashes from his torch and stokes the atmosphere of joy and fellowship in every humble place they visit. Veridical perception is typically not an emotionally charged event in a near-death experience. Rather, it presents as blunt truth and prosaic fact and is often described as seeming, quote, more real than real. Patients will describe equipment used in the operating room where they died and recount mundane conversations they've overheard between the medical staff. But for Scrooge, these visions have more impact and also have the benefit of being presented as wholly authentic. He sees things as they truly are, and for the moment is unable to armor himself emotionally or intellectually against their impact. The truth is bracing and painful. Bob Cratchit is very poor. Tiny Tim is very sick. Scrooge's nephew Fred likes him, but really, he pities him. And Scrooge cannot argue with any of it or defend himself from it. It's more real than real. And in its presence, he couldn't muster a bah or a humbug if you paid him. And that is saying something. This sequence of Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present is my favorite, both in the book and in the movie. It was now past 1 a.m., and my own Christmas Eve wanderings had come to an end. I was back home, and Owen's Game Boy was under the tree along with all the other presents I'd bought, and I was in bed watching my VHS copy of Scrooge and trying to finally, somehow, get into a Christmas mood. Officially, Christmas Eve was over. I was now at least an hour into Christmas Day. The reason I've always thought of myself as a Christmas Eve person as opposed to a Christmas Day person is because Christmas Eve is all about anticipation. Christmas Day is about realization. For me, anticipation is everything. It can take whatever form my heart desires, but realization is always concrete. Tonight's Christmas Eve was different. There was no anticipation, only dread. Tomorrow would be the first Christmas morning since I'd moved out. Michelle was coming over, and I was not looking forward to it. There was just too much opportunity for emotional outbursts, and that is exactly what I didn't want, for me or for the kids. Being around Michelle now only meant feeling guilty and bad and afraid. Rather than being something to look forward to, Christmas morning would be an ordeal to be endured, something to be gotten through. Is this how people start to hate Christmas, I thought? I knew those people existed. I knew they were out there. I was watching one of them on my TV right now. Albert Finney in his age makeup, striding through the snowy streets of London, pimped out in a long black coat and top hat singing "I Hate People." I didn't hate people, and I didn't hate Christmas. But that wasn't good enough. I wanted to fucking love Christmas the way I had as a kid, and I didn't know how to make that happen. My therapist said that moving out on my own and getting a divorce was an opportunity for me to rebuild my life in the way that I wanted it to be, without placing my mother's needs or Michelle's before my own. That sounded great, but how do you do that? And what exactly were my needs? Right now, I needed Christmas Eve to be like it was when I was a kid. I needed to be swallowed up in the middle of a family who loved each other and me. And the problem was, that was something I just didn't have anymore. Not my old family, not my new family. And maybe I thought I never would. Scrooge was now inside his dark, dusty, cavernous warehouse of a home, and the ghostly figure of Jacob Marley was slowly approaching him. I knew what was coming for Scrooge, and with a sad thought, I realized that even though he and I were having a rough Christmas Eve, his Christmas morning was going to be way better than mine. The ghost of Christmas present recedes, and in place of this being of light comes the ultimate creature of darkness, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This ghost is the embodiment of the transitional zone, a living tunnel of darkness that will eventually transport Scrooge into the light. While in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, Scrooge sees visions of the future, but he doesn't see himself in any of them. Now, even in these grim scenes, Dickens' sense of humor, or at least irony, is strongly present. We understand long before Scrooge does that not only is he dead, but that the reaction of others to this news ranges only from indifference to delight. In the cases of real-life near-death experiences, there are rare instances of people being shown their own future. One woman was even shown her eventual meeting with Raymond Moody. What makes this vision so interesting is that she received this vision in 1967, long before Moody had published his book or even begun studying NDEs. In her vision, she wasn't told the significance of the meeting or the man, only his name. And when they finally did meet by chance on Halloween night in 1974, it was months before the publication of Life After Life. She told him she had died and been told that they would meet. He smiled and basically said, "You're never going to guess what I do for a living." They became lifelong friends. Some near-death experiencers receive more disturbing visions of the future, vivid messages of global apocalypse. And for many, the same specific year has been mentioned. 1988. Okay, look, it was a pretty bad year. And I'm looking at you, Crocodile Dundee, too. But I wouldn't exactly call it apocalyptic. For Scrooge, the true nature of his fate doesn't become clear to him until the ghost of Christmas yet to come literally drags him into a graveyard and points him at his own grave. There, see? You're dead. Dead, okay? Everyone's been talking about you. You're the dead one. Do you get it now? Scrooge gets it. But of course, his transformation was already complete. For him, the horror of this news isn't dying. It's dying before he can take his new refurbished soul out for a spin and try to do some good in the world. When Scrooge wakes up in his bedroom, he is so overcome with relief and gratitude that he begins his new life of generosity and kindness immediately. He does 3 specific things that I would like to call out. He reconnects with his nephew Fred. He walks through the streets of London, taking in the sights and sounds with pleasure, and interacts with strangers that he meets with interest and friendliness. And finally, he gives his sole employee, Bob Cratchit, a raise and takes a genuine human interest in his life and circumstances. You know what he doesn't do? He doesn't run for parliament. He doesn't start a religion based on his newfound occult knowledge. He doesn't go on a lecture circuit. Come to think of it, he doesn't even start a podcast. Every change in his life is ground level and arm's distance. It's all based on the simple pleasure of compassionate interactions with those around him. It's not about one man changing the world. It's about one man changing his world. And this is what makes A Christmas Carol so universal and immortal, because it provides us with a way of living our lives differently that we can put into action right now. We are told by Dickens' narrator that the changes wrought in Scrooge lasted to the end of his days. This is the part that sounds the most story-like and the most happily ever after. The part our poor wasted souls can't help but look upon with, God forbid, skepticism. And it won't be news to you, dear listener, that many skeptics question the validity of NDEs and openly mock the people who claim to have them. It is the same for Scrooge. And Dickens, of course, sees this coming and beats everyone to the punch. Quote, "Some people laughed to see the alteration in Scrooge, but he let them laugh and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset." But what about real near-death experiencers? Do the changes wrought in them last to the end of their days? Well, the answer in a word is yes. Most experiencers report a distinct loss of interest in material gain and find themselves focusing far more on meaningful interpersonal relationships. They become less religious, but more spiritual. Many quit their jobs, leave unhappy marriages, and make other large changes in their lives. You might think that such drastic moves are ill-advised, but long-term studies have shown that the life changes brought about by near-death experiences are both positive and permanent. Real living human beings, not fictional creations like Scrooge, are somehow truly and deeply changed for the better, and the effects last years, decades, until the end of their days. Can we take a little bit of Scrooge's near-death experience and use it as our own? Every year since 1843, millions of us do. For a little while, an hour or two, or maybe a few days, we live a transformed life. We think of Scrooge's closed-up heart and try to open up our own. We know it won't last, but for a while at least, we try. Charles Dickens spent the rest of his life keeping the spirit of his story alive. He performed the book, the entire book, on stage and played all the characters. People loved seeing it, and he loved doing it, and many people say it exhausted him beyond endurance and contributed to his death. But there was one other thing. On June 9th, 1865, at exactly 3:13 p.m., Charles Dickens was on board the Southeastern Railway Folkestone to London when it derailed and crashed, killing 10 people and seriously injuring 40 others. According to every account, the scene of the accident was horrible beyond imagination. The agonized screams of the injured and dying filled the air. Dickens did what he could to aid his fellow passengers, bringing them water and brandy, and helping others extricate themselves from the wreckage. While he was uninjured in the collision, the accident still took its toll. In what would now be understood as a post-traumatic stress reaction, Dickens lost his voice for 2 weeks. And for the rest of his life, he suffered from nervous anxiety and dreaded train travel, avoiding it whenever he could. His son Henry reported, quote, I have seen him sometimes in a railroad carriage when there was a slight jolt. When this happened, he was almost in a state of panic and gripped the seat with both hands. His daughter Mary reported that after the accident, he was never the same. While he continued writing and performing for the remainder of his life, his health steadily declined. Exactly 5 years later to the day, June 9th, 1870, Charles Dickens suffered a stroke and died. My mom loved Scrooge, the movie. We had the soundtrack album in our house, and she played it over and over every Christmas, along with her other favorite Christmas albums. Christmas Is by Percy Faith, his orchestra and chorus. Now Is the Caroling Season by Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians, and the Andy Williams Christmas album. When we watched the movie each year, my dad always pretended to cheer for Scrooge. At least I think he was pretending. In any case, he never seemed outwardly moved the way my mother and I were. Most of my Christmas memories center on my mom and how much she loved every part of the holiday, and how somehow, at least for December, she seemed centered and calm and truly happy. And that is what I try to feel every Christmas when I play the soundtrack from Scrooge and remember how it felt the first time. But the one Christmas I remember the most was the one when I insisted that my dad buy me a present with no help from my mom. And what he came up with was this: a pair of fingernail clippers, a bottle of Old Spice aftershave, a 3-pack of white gym socks, and a paperback copy of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the first copy I ever owned. I have it still. Owen opened his Game Boy Advance for me on Christmas morning and was truly thrilled. Thank God. Apparently my efforts had been worth it. And it took almost 4 days before Spencer started crying in rage and despair every time he saw Owen playing with it, because now he too wanted a Game Boy Advance and his life meant nothing without it, and he was going to make everyone else's life a living hell until the situation was resolved. Michelle came over that Christmas morning, and it actually went pretty well until she started to cry and abruptly left, and I spent the rest of the day feeling guilty and angry and scared and generally unfestive. In fact, I didn't start feeling good again until late Christmas night, after the boys were asleep, when I realized that the worst was finally over. I ordered a pizza and watched The Bishop's Wife alone by the fireplace and was happy. 2 more Christmases passed without improvement. It was now a weekend in July. Susan Lambert and I were together now, and we were spending the weekend in Santa Barbara. It was ungodly hot, which is not typical for Santa Barbara at any time of year. We were enjoying a cocktail at a patio bar in an area of town known unappealingly as the Funk Zone. And again, I was complaining about Christmas. According to Susan, this was something I did a lot. I was going on and on about how my family had ruined it. And then I had ruined it, and now it was ruined. And then Susan, in her Susan-y way, said something like, "Why don't you throw your own Christmas Eve party?" I tried to explain to her why that was impossible. No members of my mother's side of the family would tolerate a get-together at this point. My dad's side celebrated on Christmas Day. Michelle's family? Well, we were on good terms, but they'd be with Michelle. Who was left? "Well," she said, "who would you like to see on Christmas Eve? Who do you like? Who makes you happy?" she said. I looked at her and thought, "You make me happy." But I didn't say it. We'd only been dating a little while, and the words felt too much like "I love you." A person had to be careful. "Why don't you throw a big Christmas Eve party? An open house. Start early, go late. Invite everybody. Your relatives, your friends, your agent, everyone. The only requirement is you'd like to see them on Christmas Eve." It was something I'd never thought of. I took a sip of my drink and considered Susan's words. Just invite whoever I wanted? It would never work. There were just too many people who didn't get along. Too many people who might get upset. It's an open house, Susan said. People can come and go as they please. I thought about what my therapist had said all those years ago, about rebuilding my life the way I wanted it to be, based on what I wanted. Wasn't that what I was doing with Susan? The feeling scared me. Was I allowed to do what made me happy? I looked at Susan smiling at me from across her gin and tonic. Maybe this idea had possibilities after all. How could I possibly hurt people just by inviting them to a Christmas Eve party? I reached into my brown leather bag, which I have with me at all times, and together, Susan and I started making a list of all the people I could think of to invite. An hour later, we had 200 names. While we sat together that evening, making our list and checking it twice, I thought about Scrooge's nephew, Fred, and the party he threw on Christmas Eve. The food and the games and the dancing. I thought about Armando's house with its noise and laughter and the flashing lights and the smell of barbecue. And I thought about my own Christmas Eves, the punch I made and the presents we wrapped, and the laughing with my cousins as Grampy tossed wads of wrapping paper at our heads. I would remake Christmas the way I wanted it to be. I felt transformed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt excitement. So much so that I suggested to Susan that maybe we should head back to the motel room immediately. Cool your jets, she said. I'd like another drink, and maybe a walk on the beach after dinner. Dinner and a walk? Okay. Maybe I could wait. After all, I'm a Christmas Eve guy. Anticipation is everything. Thank you for joining me on Richard Hatem's Paranormal Bookshelf. Richard Hatem's Paranormal Bookshelf is presented by Astonishing Legends, 134 West, and Summerland Entertainment. Executive producers Scott Philbrook, Forrest Burgess, and Susan Lambert. Our associate producer is Tess Feifel, and our sound designer, engineer, and editor is Kevin Ducey. Artwork is by Tommy Beaver, website is by Kayla Lord, and our music, as always, is by Nima Kazaruni. Until next time, be safe and be well, find the light in the dark, and we'll see you again soon.